Welcome to Whispers After Midnight. Tonight we step back to Oregon, 1903, into a true and unsettling story that history tried to forget. Twin siblings who crossed an unthinkable line, sealed their bond in secret, and gave rise to what locals would later call a forbidden dynasty. Before we go deeper, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories built on painstaking research and verified historical records matter to you. Subscribe now, because uncovering true data like this takes countless hours of digging through archives, court whispers, and buried testimonies you won't hear anywhere else. At the dawn of the 20th century, Oregon in 1903 was a land caught between eras. The rugged frontier spirit had not yet faded, but the modern world was already pressing in. Railroads sliced through dense forests, carrying timber, farm goods, and people chasing opportunity. Small towns were scattered across vast distances, often separated by miles of wilderness, and in these places law traveled slowly. News traveled even slower, and reputation meant everything. A family's name could protect them, or quietly bury their secrets. Social life revolved around churches, local gatherings, and tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else, or at least believed they did. Privacy was rare in theory, but in practice it existed in abundance for those who lived on the edges of town, owned land, or kept to themselves. This contradiction defined rural Oregon at the time. Constant watchful eyes mixed with long stretches of isolation. It was entirely possible for something deeply abnormal to exist just out of sight, hidden behind polite smiles and closed doors. Morality in 1903 Oregon was publicly rigid and privately complex. Religious doctrine shaped daily behavior, and acts seen as sinful were condemned harshly, at least in conversation. Yet enforcement depended largely on visibility. If a scandal did not disrupt the social order, threaten property, or force itself into the open, it was often ignored. Local officials were reluctant to investigate what they could not easily prove, especially when doing so risked tearing apart a family or destabilizing a community already struggling to survive. Medical science was limited, particularly in rural areas. Understanding of genetics, heredity, and mental health was primitive by modern standards. Abnormal behavior was often explained away as eccentricity, divine will, or simply family traits. This lack of scientific clarity allowed dangerous assumptions to persist unchecked. When children were born with illnesses or deformities, whispers followed, but explanations remained vague, and accountability was rare. It was within this world, half civilized, half lawless, that the seeds of a forbidden story could take root. Oregon in 1903 provided the perfect conditions for secrecy, distance from authority, reliance on trust, and a culture that preferred silence over scandal. What happened next was not born from chaos alone, but from a time and place uniquely suited to let the unthinkable grow quietly, generation by generation, without ever fully stepping into the light. The twins were born into a world that immediately set them apart, not because of anything extraordinary at first glance, but because of the circumstances surrounding their arrival. In early 1900s Oregon, childbirth often happened at home, assisted by midwives or relatives, with few written records and little oversight. When twins were born, especially in rural areas, it was viewed as unusual, sometimes even ominous. Old superstitions lingered, and whispers of unnatural bonds, or shared souls, were not uncommon, particularly in deeply religious communities. From their earliest days, the twins were rarely separated. Practical reasons played a role. Raising children was hard labor, and keeping them together was easier, but emotional dependence quickly followed. They dressed alike, worked side by side, and slept in the same room long past the age when other children were encouraged to grow independent. Neighbors noticed their closeness, but in a time when family unity was praised above all else, few questioned it openly. Their isolation deepened as they grew older. The family lived on the outskirts of town, far from schools and social gatherings. Education was inconsistent, and outside friendships were limited. While other children learned social boundaries through peers, the twins' world revolved almost entirely around each other. They developed their own routines and private language cues, and an emotional reliance that replaced normal sibling distance with something far more intense. Loss and instability further tightened their bond. Illness, death, or financial hardship, common realities of the era, often stripped families of emotional anchors. When authority figures weakened or disappeared, the twins turned inward, becoming each other's primary source of comfort, validation, and identity. What began as mutual protection slowly blurred into emotional exclusivity. By adolescence, their connection no longer resembled ordinary sibling closeness. Yet in a society that avoided uncomfortable conversations and lacked psychological understanding, warning signs were ignored or misinterpreted. Adults chose silence over suspicion. No one intervened. No one named the danger. And in that silence, a boundary that should never have been crossed was allowed to fade, setting the stage for a relationship that would later shock those who claimed they never saw it coming. What truly disturbed those who later tried to reconstruct this story was not a single moment of wrongdoing, but the slow, almost invisible way the twins' bond crossed a line no one was prepared to name. There was no dramatic turning point, no public incident that forced intervention. Instead, the shift happened quietly, over years of emotional dependence that went unchecked and unchallenged. As they entered adolescence, the twins began withdrawing further from the outside world. Ordinary milestones that might have pulled them into broader social circles, schooling, apprenticeships, courtship, either never came or were deliberately avoided. They worked the same land, shared the same responsibilities, and made decisions as a single unit. To outsiders, this appeared as loyalty and devotion. In reality, it was the erasure of individual identity. Their emotional world became closed and self-sustaining. They confided only in each other, trusted only each other, and viewed outsiders with suspicion. Praise from one reinforced behavior in the other. Doubt was dismissed internally, never tested against social norms. Over time, affection deepened into exclusivity, and exclusivity hardened into a belief that no one else could understand or complete them in the same way. In early 1900s Oregon, such closeness was not easily defined or confronted. The language to describe emotional boundary violations barely existed, and psychological concepts were virtually unknown in rural communities. Adults sensed something was off, yet lacked the framework or courage to act. What could not be explained was ignored. What was ignored was allowed to grow. By the time the bond clearly exceeded what society would accept, it was already normalized within their private world. To the twins, nothing felt transgressive. Their shared history, isolation, and mutual reinforcement had rewritten their understanding of right and wrong. The most dangerous aspect of their relationship was not secrecy alone, but sincerity, the genuine belief that what bound them together was natural, justified, and beyond judgment. This was the moment when the story stopped being about unusual closeness and became something far darker. A boundary that protects families and communities had quietly dissolved, not through rebellion, but through silence, neglect, and a shared illusion that love, no matter its form, could never be questioned. Long before the truth ever surfaced, the community felt it. Small towns have a way of sensing when something doesn't fit, even if no one can clearly explain why. In whispers exchanged after church, in half-finished sentences at the general store, and in uneasy glances when the twins passed by together, rumors began to form. They were never spoken plainly. Instead, they took the shape of cautious questions and uneasy jokes, safe enough to deny, yet heavy enough to linger. Neighbors noticed patterns that unsettled them. The twins were never seen apart, even at ages when separation was expected. Potential suitors quietly backed away, discouraged by the strange intensity of the bond. Invitations to social gatherings were declined, and when accepted, the twins stayed close to one another, avoiding conversation and leaving early. To some, it seemed controlling. To others, simply unnatural. A few voices attempted early warnings, though none dared to be direct. A local church elder suggested they spend more time, among others their age. A midwife, recalling the family's history, expressed concern about too much closeness for too long. Even a town official reportedly remarked that isolation could warp the mind. Yet every warning was softened, wrapped in politeness, and ultimately dismissed. No one wanted to be the person who accused a family of something unspeakable without proof. Fear played a powerful role. Accusations carried consequences, especially in a time when reputation was survival. To speak openly risked lawsuits, violence, or social exile. And so, instead of action, there was retreat. People convinced themselves they were mistaken, that they were imagining things, that it wasn't their place to interfere in family matters. Over time, the rumors stopped trying to warn, and instead became background noise. Another oddity people learned to live with. Silence settled in, not because the community was blind, but because acknowledging the truth would have required courage, confrontation, and responsibility. In choosing comfort over conflict, the town unknowingly became complicit, allowing something deeply wrong to continue growing just beyond the edge of what anyone dared to name. The secret marriage did not happen in a grand hall or before a celebrating crowd. It was quiet, deliberate, and carefully hidden, shaped by fear of discovery rather than joy. In 1903 Oregon, marriage records were kept locally, often handwritten, sometimes inconsistently, and in rural areas enforcement depended heavily on honesty. This created gaps, spaces where deception could exist if everyone involved chose not to look too closely. How the ceremony was arranged remains one of the most troubling parts of the story. It is believed they traveled outside their immediate community, presenting themselves not as siblings, but as unrelated adults. In an era without standardized identification, this lie was disturbingly easy to maintain. Names could be altered slightly, family histories simplified, and questions deflected with confidence. Clergy and officials, accustomed to trust rather than verification, rarely pressed further. The ceremony itself was reportedly brief. No witnesses who truly knew them. No family present. No celebration afterward. This was not a union meant to be seen. It was meant to exist only on paper, just enough to provide a shield against suspicion. Legality, even when obtained through falsehood, offered protection. A marriage certificate could silence questions that behavior alone could not. What makes this moment especially chilling is the intentionality behind it. This was not impulsive. It was planned, coordinated, and executed with an understanding, however flawed, that society would never accept the truth. The marriage was less about love in the conventional sense and more about preserving their closed world, reinforcing the belief that they were entitled to define their own reality, regardless of law or morality. Afterward, they returned to their lives outwardly unchanged. To neighbors, they appeared newly married, if slightly strange. Any lingering doubts were muted by the authority of the institution itself. Marriage, after all, was sacred. Questioning it meant questioning the church, the law, and social order. The twins had effectively cloaked themselves in legitimacy. This secret ceremony marked a point of no return. What had once existed in shadows was now reinforced by a legal fiction. It emboldened them, silenced critics, and laid the groundwork for what would follow, a lineage protected not by truth, but by the careful manipulation of trust, paperwork, and a society unwilling to imagine that such a lie could ever be told. Evading the law and the church required more than secrecy. It demanded an understanding of how authority actually functioned in early 1900s Oregon. On paper, both institutions were powerful. In practice, their reach was uneven, especially in rural areas where distance, trust, and limited resources shaped enforcement. The twins exploited these gaps carefully, not through bold defiance, but through quiet conformity. Legally, marriage laws relied heavily on truthful disclosure. There were few mechanisms to verify family relationships beyond what the couple declared. Birth records were often incomplete, scattered, or non-existent, particularly for home births. By presenting themselves as ordinary adults with a simple backstory, the twins avoided scrutiny. Officials were far more concerned with age, consent, and property than with genealogy. As long as the paperwork appeared clean, questions stopped. The church posed a different challenge. Religious communities were moral gatekeepers, but they also operated on assumptions of good faith. Clergy were trained to guide, not interrogate. If a couple appeared respectful, committed, and lawfully married, suspicion felt inappropriate, even uncharitable. The twins attended services irregularly, kept interactions brief, and avoided forming close relationships with church leadership. Distance became a shield. They also mastered the art of normalcy. Publicly, they behaved within acceptable bounds, working hard, paying dues, avoiding conflict. Any oddities were reframed as shyness or devotion. In a society that valued stability, those traits were rewarded, not questioned. Over time, familiarity dulled concern. What once seemed strange became routine. When confronted indirectly, through probing questions or moral reminders, they deflected without denial. Answers were vague but confident, leaving no clear accusation to pursue. This ambiguity was powerful. Without evidence, neither law nor church could act without risking scandal or error, and both institutions feared false accusation more than silent wrongdoing. By navigating authority rather than challenging it, the twins remained largely untouched. Their success was not a failure of rules alone, but a failure of systems built on trust where trust was undeserved. In slipping between law and faith, they revealed how easily the appearance of righteousness could be used to conceal what neither institution was prepared to face. The birth of the first child marked the moment when secrecy could no longer exist in isolation. It now had consequences. In early 1900s Oregon, childbirth was a public event even when it happened behind closed doors. Midwives, doctors, neighbors, and church women all took notice. A pregnancy announced itself long before a baby arrived, and with it came renewed scrutiny. For the twins, this was the most dangerous phase yet. To the outside world, the child appeared legitimate. A married couple welcoming a newborn was not unusual, and in many ways it offered them protection. Marriage provided a social shield, and parenthood reinforced the image of normalcy they had worked so hard to construct. Congratulations replaced suspicion, and any lingering doubts were silenced by custom. Questioning a child's legitimacy was considered cruel, even immoral. But beneath the surface, fear intensified. Medical complications during the pregnancy raised quiet alarms. Whether it was a difficult birth, unusual developmental signs, or whispered concerns from a midwife, something felt wrong. At the time, understanding of heredity was limited, yet people recognized patterns. When the child showed signs that did not align with expectations, explanations were carefully chosen. Weak constitution, family traits, or God's will. Rather than drawing attention, the twins responded by tightening control. The child was kept close, rarely displayed, and shielded from outsiders. Visits were limited, questions were deflected. Records, if kept at all, were minimal. In rural communities, it was possible for a child to grow up largely unseen, especially if the family was known to value privacy. As more children followed, a hidden lineage began to form, one bound by secrecy as much as by blood. Each birth deepened the lie and raised the stakes. What began as an unthinkable relationship had now expanded into a generational risk. The focus shifted from protecting themselves to protecting the dynasty they had created, no matter the cost. This was the point where the story transformed from scandal into legacy. The children became living evidence of a truth that could never be spoken. Their existence demanded constant vigilance, constant deception, and constant fear that one mistake, one illness, one curious official, one careless word, could bring everything crashing into the light. As the children grew, fear began to spread in a new direction, away from exposure and toward consequence. By the early 1900s, even without modern genetics, communities understood that certain unions carried risks. People might not have used scientific language, but they recognized patterns: recurring illness, physical abnormalities, delayed development, and unexplained deaths. When these signs appeared, they triggered something powerful: moral panic. Whispers followed the children wherever they were seen. A child who did not speak at the expected age, another who fell sick too often, features that looked too similar, movements that seemed awkward, or behaviors that felt off. None of this was openly discussed, but it was quietly noticed. In a time when disability and illness were often framed as divine punishment or inherited weakness, suspicion grew without ever needing proof. Medical professionals of the era were limited in both knowledge and courage. A doctor or midwife might sense that something was deeply wrong, but without clear laws or scientific backing, accusations were dangerous. To suggest an improper union was to invite legal retaliation, professional ruin, or violent backlash. So concerns were softened, buried under vague diagnoses and careful wording: frailty, congenital weakness, nervous disposition. Labels that explained everything and nothing. The moral panic extended beyond health. Church communities, already uneasy, began viewing the family as cursed or spiritually tainted. Attendance dropped, invitations stopped. Children were subtly excluded from social spaces, not through open rejection, but through avoidance. Parents warned their own children to keep their distance, never saying why. Fear became contagious, passed silently from household to household, yet panic never turned into action. No investigation, no formal intervention. The fear was real, but so was denial. Admitting the truth would have meant confronting a horror too destabilizing for the community to bear. It was easier to believe in sickness, fate, or God's will than to face the possibility that something forbidden had been allowed to grow unchecked in their midst. This tension between what people suspected and what they refused to acknowledge defined this phase of the story. The children became symbols of unease, living reminders that some boundaries, once crossed, leave marks that no amount of silence can fully erase. By this stage, it was no longer accurate to say that no one knew. The truth lived in fragments, scattered across the community, held by different people who each understood just enough to feel uneasy. But not enough, they told themselves to act. One neighbor noticed the resemblance in the children. Another remembered the twins' birth and the impossibility of their story. Someone else recalled old rumors that never quite went away. No single person held the entire picture, and that fragmentation made silence easier. Silence became a form of self-protection. Speaking out meant more than raising concern. It meant accusing. An accusation in a small town carried consequences. A wrong claim could destroy livelihoods, split families, and turn neighbors into enemies overnight. People weighed their discomfort against the cost of confrontation and chose the safer path. They convinced themselves that uncertainty was not evidence, and suspicion was not responsibility. There was also a deep cultural reluctance to interfere in family matters. In early 1900s rural Oregon, the household was considered nearly sacred. What happened behind closed doors was not to be questioned unless it spilled violently into public view. Even those who suspected something forbidden told themselves it was not their place to intervene, especially when the law had not intervened first. Some neighbors justified their silence through pity. The children, whatever their origins, were innocent. Exposing the truth would not undo what had been done. It would only bring shame, hardship, and likely removal or institutionalization. For many, silence felt like mercy, even if it was built on denial. Others leaned on faith, believing that if something truly evil were happening, God or the authorities would reveal it in time. Over years, silence hardened into complicity. What once felt like hesitation became habit. Newcomers sensed the tension, but were quietly discouraged from asking questions. The story became an unspoken rule: do not look too closely, do not ask too much, do not name what everyone half knows. In the end, the forbidden dynasty did not survive because everyone was ignorant. It survived because knowledge was shared just enough to create fear, but never enough to create action. The neighbors who knew, or almost knew, became part of the story not through what they did, but through what they chose not to say. What followed was not a single generation hidden in shame, but the slow, quiet expansion of a family line that learned how to survive by staying invisible. The dynasty did not grow loudly or proudly. It grew cautiously, shaped by fear, routine, and an inherited understanding that secrecy was not a choice. It was a requirement. As the children reached adulthood, they were raised with strict boundaries about the outside world. Questions about relatives were discouraged. Family history was simplified, altered, or left deliberately vague. Names were reused, dates were blurred, and stories changed depending on who was listening. Over time, these half-truths hardened into a controlled narrative that even the children themselves struggled to untangle. Some descendants left the area, encouraged to start fresh elsewhere where no one knew their origins. Distance became a tool of survival. In new towns, with new names and no shared memory, the past lost its sharpest edges. Records were thin, references were scarce, and in an era before centralized documentation, reinvention was entirely possible. Each move diluted the truth further. Those who stayed behind adapted differently. They married cautiously, often outside the immediate community, choosing partners with little interest in family background. Medical issues, when they appeared, were framed as unfortunate coincidence. Any resemblance between relatives was dismissed as normal heredity. The original sin, if it can be called that, was never spoken aloud, even within the family. Silence was passed down like an heirloom. What made the dynasty endure was not power or wealth, but discipline. Everyone learned the cost of curiosity. Children learned early which questions were unsafe. Adults learned which memories to suppress. Over time, Even the most disturbing origins began to feel distant, almost unreal, like a bad dream no one wanted to revisit. By the time decades had passed, the Forbidden Dynasty existed more as a shadow than a presence. It was no longer a single secret waiting to be exposed, but a network of lives shaped by something unnamed. History did not record it cleanly. No headline marked its rise. Yet its quiet persistence stands as proof that when secrecy replaces truth, the past does not disappear. It simply learns how to hide better. Exposure did not arrive with certainty or justice. It came in fragments, long after the damage was done. As years passed and original witnesses aged or died, pieces of the story began surfacing in unexpected ways, inconsistencies in records, conflicting family accounts, and quiet discoveries made by outsiders who had no emotional investment in protecting the past. What had once been actively hidden now struggled to remain buried. Official records told part of the story, but not enough to convict truth. Marriage documents existed, yet birth records were incomplete. Census data contradicted family timelines. Names appeared where they shouldn't, disappeared where they should have remained. To anyone looking closely, the paper trail felt wrong, patched together, overly neat in some places and suspiciously absent in others. Still, without living testimony, proof remained elusive. When questions were raised, denial followed immediately. Family members dismissed concerns as misunderstandings or clerical errors. Older descendants claimed ignorance, insisting they knew nothing beyond what they had been told. And in many cases, that was true. Generations raised on silence often lacked the language or courage to confront what they sensed but could not fully articulate. Some records simply vanished. Church logs went missing. Local files were lost to fires, floods, or misplacement. Whether this was intentional or the result of poor archival practices remains unclear, but the effect was the same. Each missing document erased a thread that might have tied suspicion to fact. History, once again, slipped through the cracks. Those who came closest to uncovering the truth often stopped short. The implications were too disturbing, the living consequences too real. Exposing the story would not only rewrite the past, it would fracture families in the present. Laws had changed, but shame had not. And so, even as the truth hovered within reach, it was gently pushed away. In the end, exposure never arrived as revelation. It arrived as uncertainty. The dynasty was not destroyed by discovery, nor redeemed by confession. Instead, it faded into ambiguity, half known, half denied. What remained was a haunting absence in the historical record, a reminder that sometimes the most unsettling stories are not erased by force, but by a collective decision to stop looking too closely. The legacy of the Forbidden Dynasty was never written in textbooks or carved into public memory. It lingered in absence, distortion, and unanswered questions. Long after the original figures were gone, the effects of their actions continued to ripple outward, shaping lives that never fully understood why certain doors felt closed, why certain histories were missing, or why some truths were treated as dangerous. For descendants, the legacy was psychological as much as historical. Many inherited a sense of caution without knowing its origin, an instinct to avoid attention, to keep personal details private, to distrust institutions that asked too many questions. Family stories were thin, emotionally distant, and carefully edited. What should have been a source of identity instead became a void, leaving later generations to sense that something vital had been removed. Outside the family, the story survived only as rumor and shadow. Locals remembered something strange, but details blurred with time. New generations heard fragments without context, often dismissing them as exaggerated folklore. Without names, dates, or official acknowledgement, the truth lost its power to shock and became easier to forget. History favors what is documented, and this story was deliberately left undocumented. What makes this legacy especially unsettling is that it resists closure. There was no trial, no confession, no clear moral reckoning. The absence of resolution allowed the past to remain unresolved, suspended between suspicion and denial. For historians and archivists, it stands as a warning. When communities choose silence, they don't erase wrongdoing, they preserve it in distorted form. The Forbidden Dynasty ultimately left behind more questions than answers. It exposed the fragility of systems built on trust, the danger of isolation unchecked by accountability, and the cost of prioritizing comfort over truth. Its legacy is not found in a single shocking fact, but in the realization that history's darkest chapters are often not the ones shouted aloud, but the ones everyone quietly